Welcome back this week. And I wonder what it is we'll be talking about this week. Maybe the word behind me will give you a clue. So, with that said, let's jump right in. When those of us who are engaged in full time ministry get together, there are many things we talk about. We talk about our frustrations. We talk about the things that we must personally sacrifice in order to live out our call. And we talk about the things that we're doing in our ministry settings so we can share resources and help each other out. But sadly, there is one thing we rarely talk about when we get together, and that is how the practice of ministry has made us better people. Well, this week, because of our reading, I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about some of those ways. I know that because of ministry, for instance, I've gained an incredible sense of compassion. I've also gained the ability to see things from multiple perspectives, often simultaneously. And they even picked up from ministry a sense of perspective about literally everything, especially life and death. And out of all of the things that I've gained from ministry, there is one thing in particular that has really rocked my world in an incredibly positive way. That is, it's given me a sense of patience. For you see, when I entered ministry at the ripe old age of 32, I was known for moving through life at 100 miles an hour. Whenever I saw a problem, I would pour everything I had into finding a solution as quick as possible. And then I entered parish ministry, and well, let's just say that the pace of things slowed down considerably. What used to take just a day or two in the real world now took a month or two or longer. And had I not developed an increased sense of patience, I would have never lasted in ministry more than a week or two. So how did I learn patience from ministry? Well, the stories of our faith played an incredibly large role in that. For you see, when I began to teach and preach those foundational stories regarding the matriarchs and patriarchs of the faith, I came to a whole new understanding of and appreciation for patience. And this week's reading from the book of Hebrews is a great example. For you see, that passage refers to two people who showed more patience than perhaps any other, those people being Sarah and Abraham. This was a couple that was picked up in the midst of their comfortable lives in a place called Ur, then were dragged halfway across the known world, told that they would eventually settle in the promised land and start a family, and then were forced to wait until they were nearly 100 to have that first son. Let me tell you, if that isn't patience, I don't know what is. So how did they do it? Well, I believe that it all boiled down to a little 5-letter word called faith. Now, if you're like me a little earlier in my life, you might be struggling to find the patience needed for God's promises to unfold. And if that's the case, listen carefully as I share the reading. And when I finish it, let's come back together and see if we can figure out how faith might help produce in us a little patience. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 through 3, and then I'll pick up again with verses 8 through 16, and I'll be reading from the Common English Bible. Faith is the reality of what we hope for, the proof of what we don't see. The elders in the past were approved because they showed faith. By faith, we understand that the universe has been created by a word from God, so that the visible came into existence from the invisible. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was going to receive as an inheritance, and he went out without knowing where he was going. By faith, he lived in the land he had been promised as a stranger. He lived in tents along with Isaac and Jacob, who were co-heirs of that same promise. He was looking forward to a city that has foundations and whose architect and builder is God. By faith, even Sarah received the ability to have a child, though she herself was barren and past the age for having children, because she believed that the one who promised was faithful. So descendants were born from one man, and he was as good as dead. They were as many as the number of the stars in the sky, and as countless as the grains of sand on the seashore. Now, all these people died in faith without receiving the promises, but they saw the promises from a distance and welcomed them. They confessed that they were strangers and immigrants on earth. People who say this kind of thing made it clear that they are looking for a homeland. If they had been thinking about the country they had left, they would have had the opportunity to return to it. But at this point in time, they are longing for a better country, that is, a heavenly one. And therefore, God isn't ashamed to be called their God. He has prepared a city for them. And thus ends this week's sacred reading. The author of that passage from Hebrews did us a huge solid in helping us try to understand the relationship between faith and patience when he started out by defining faith in just 16 words. Faith is the reality of what we hope for and the proof of what we don't see. Wow. That sounds good, but what does it really mean? Scholar John Shelley helps us understand what it means when he summarized those words by telling us that faith is, and I quote, a kind of seeing. And not just any kind of seeing, David Gray went on to add, it's the kind of seeing that is inextricably wed to our hopes. I can just hear what some of you out there might be thinking when I say that. You might be thinking that I'm suggesting faith is nothing more than looking out in the world with rose-colored glasses. And that might even tick some of you off, as you conclude that I'm suggesting faith means we have to ignore the pain, the suffering, and injustice that so clearly lies in front of us, just so we can see what we want. Well, friends, nothing could be further from the truth. For the key in doing the kind of seeing that John Shelley describes has nothing to do with projecting our hopes, our desires, our agenda. No, John Shelley clarifies. The kind of seeing that's referred to in the passage is about seeing God's desires for us. And in that process, looking beyond the what is to the what could be. It is in that process when everything begins to change for folks like Sarah and Abraham, you and me. How does it change? Well, Marion Swords concludes, it is faith that makes real in the present God's things, often mistakenly thought of as future, but more essentially, they are eternal. And if we have any doubt about what Marion Swords just wrote, the author of Hebrews beautifully spelled out for us what faith accomplished for Sarah and Abraham. Think back to verse 8. By faith, it said, Abraham was able to leave behind the what was and embrace his destiny. And then in the next verse, verse 9, by faith, Abraham was able to endure a transient life in order to help transform the world. And even in verse 10, by faith, Sarah was able to overcome her limited understanding of what was possible in order to welcome what God had for her and Abraham. And all of that, friends, was done because of one thing: faith. And you know what? If Sarah and Abraham were able to do all of those things by looking out in the world through the lens of faith, just imagine what might happen if we too changed the prescription and the lens through which we looked at the world. What if we tossed aside the lens of sarcasm, cynicism, and doubt and exchanged it for the lens of faith? But before you rush out and change that prescription, I do have a word of caution. For you see, exchanging the lens we see the world with doesn't mean that everything's going to become easy overnight and that all need for patience will disappear because we'll immediately get what we want. No. In fact, if you aren't careful, faith can even make it harder to be patient. For because of that faith, you will begin to live today in the land of the what could be, while others around you are still stuck in the land of what is. So how can faith help us live in that space as folks inhabit different lands? Well, John Shelley offers these words about how faith can overcome our impatience. He writes, "Because the promises of God reach beyond death, it, or that faith, often invades the present through hope, enabling a person to see the wondrous beauty that's already here, and then inspiring new possibilities for the present moment." And friends, this invasion of hope does perhaps the one thing that we need most during these challenging times as we move from one challenge to another, from COVID to monkeypox, from the war in the Ukraine to the struggles of inflation and all of the other accompanying uncertainty. For you see, as John Shelley concludes, this invasion of hope, and I quote, renews the courage of faith and enables the faithful to live freely and meaningfully in this dangerous but beautiful world. May God help us then put on this lens of faith so that we can not only see the promises before us, but use them to strengthen us so that we have the patience to endure the challenge, knowing with certainty that the what is will give way to the what will be, if only we have the courage to do what Abraham did. Take that first step in the direction to which God has called us. Have a great week. Pack those bags and get moving. We'll see you next week.